Hi, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com. Today we're going to make a strawberry tart, and this is what it looks like. This tart is just two components, a bottom layer of a buttery pastry that's crisp and crumbly, and then fresh strawberries on top that are very lightly sweetened. So you want to make this when strawberries are in season. You have you picked close by, perfect, and you can have it serve it on its own, but I love it with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. So we're going to start by making our pastry. Like I said, all butter, wonderful flavor, nice texture. I'm doing it in my food processor. You could just do it in a large bowl, do it by hand. The first thing you will need is 1 1/3 cups, which is 175 grams of all-purpose flour. You may know it as plain flour. And if you wanted to make, like, for example, you want to make an extra batch of the pastry, you could just double the recipe because the pastry freezes really well. And then what I'm adding is just a half a teaspoon, 2 grams of, I'm using a fine kosher salt, you use the table salt. And then I like to add just a little bit of sugar. So I'm adding just a half a tablespoon, 7 grams of granulated white sugar. But you could just leave that out. And now if you were doing it by hand, just whisk it, or with a fork, just whisk the ingredients together. I'm just going to process this just for a second, like so. And butter. You will need a half a cup, 113 grams. I'm using unsalted butter. 1, because I like the flavor, and 2, as I added the salt, that, you know, if you buy salted butter, depending on the brand, they can use different amounts of salt. So that's why I like to use unsalted butter, so I can control the salt in the recipe. But if you have, you know, a brand that you really like a salted butter, you could use that, and then I would just leave out the salt in the recipe. So a half a cup, 113 grams. You want the butter to be really cold here, and that's what's going to give us a really nice crisp and crumbly texture to our pastry. So what I like to do is, as you can see here, I've cut it into small chunks. And what I do is, now if you think of it the night before, I cut it into small chunks and put it on a plate like this and cover it with plastic wrap and put it into the refrigerator. And that way each chunk will get really cold. The other way, if you forget, which I often do, I just do this and then just pop the plate into the freezer for about 10 minutes. And that will get the butter really cold. So just pop that in there. If you're doing this by hand, if you have a pastry blender, or you could just use your fingers, what we're going to do is just process this, I mean, not for very long, maybe 10 seconds, just until it's coarse crumbs. And there may be bigger chunks of butter that you can see. That's absolutely fine. But try not to overprocess. Just kind of pulse it. Okay, I didn't time it, but I'm going to say 10 seconds. And as you can see, there's still chunks of butter. That's fine. So now, the water. Again, what I do, you want nice icy cold water. So what I did here, and you can see, I just put a glass, put some ice cubes in it, and then some water, and it's really cold. And then, you know, when flour can absorb when you're making pastry, different amounts of water depending on how the flour was transported and stored. So I'm going to say about 3 tablespoons, maybe a little less, maybe up to 4, depending on your flour. It's not like exact science. So, although I made this before, so I know for mine, it takes about 3. You know, at home you might want to use just a touch less than 3, and then you can mix it and then judge from there. But what we're going to do is we're just going to pulse it and let's scrape that down until it starts to come together. You don't process it to like a solid ball. You want it still kind of loose, but when you kind of squeeze it, it'll hold together. But I'll show you how to do that. I do like to stop maybe once or twice because the butter does stick to and the flour stick to the side, and then get the bottom of the bowl. If you're doing this by hand, you could just toss it with your fingers or a fork. You can start, the sound of your food processor will change when it's coming together. So, I'll just take, I think it's about right. So this is what, see, it's not a solid ball, but when I squeeze it, it holds together. And make sure you want it to not feel dry. You know, sometimes it can come together, but if you put it in a ball like this and squeeze it, it feels a little dry. So just add you know, maybe another teaspoon of water. So now, I have a piece of plastic wrap here. Just gonna and we want to handle our pastry as little as possible. So what I do is kind of just put it, and then I just use the plastic wrap to kind of bring it together. Just kind of go around and squeeze it. So, and then just put it into a, you know, round. What would that be? About, I don't know, six, 7, you know, 18 centimeter round. It's not critical. And then we want to chill this so that the butter firms up and the gluten in the flour relaxes. So I'm going to say put it into the refrigerator about an hour. I mean, you could leave it longer, but you want it firm enough to roll out. So at least I would say an hour. And then when we come back, we will roll it out. So I chilled the pastry. Now we're ready to roll it out. Now you will need a baking sheet. I've lined mine with parchment paper. And you have your pastry. And then you want to lightly flour your surface. Now, if you're new to rolling out pastry, it can be a little tricky, especially with the all butter. You know, if it's too cold, it could crack. If it's too warm, it'll stick. So it's just a matter of practice. Do not worry. Just, you know, patch it together as best as you can. Now, we're going to roll this into about, you know, a 13-inch round, which is about 33 centimeters. So, you know, you can eyeball it or your ruler, trusty ruler. So and I'm just going to lightly do the top, and then your rolling pin. The important thing when you're rolling, you have your pastry, is keep turning it. Roll it a bit, and then turn it. And that way, if it's sticking to the counter, you can put a little more flour. So like I said, if it was really starting, it's cracking a lot, probably because it, you know, it's chilled too much, just then stop. Let it sit on your counter about 5 minutes, and then carry on. Conversely, if it's really sticking because it's not chilled enough, then just cover it and put it back into the refrigerator. So I'm just moving it around because, you know, you want to get it an even thickness. That's what's important. And, you know, periodically, I know it's hard. This is a free-form tart. What I love about that, if you don't get that perfect circle, which I never do, who cares? Because it's a free-form tart. So as long as it's all the same thickness, that's what's important here. And kind of roll, you know, from the center. Because typically with pastry, it'll be thicker in the center than the sides. So, but just run your hand over. If you run your hand over the top of the pastry, you can tell where it's thicker in some places, and then just roll that. And if your edges are, you know, kind of like that, and just patch it. Just patch it together. Even it up if, you know, get a nicer looking round. But that's the beauty of a free form. It doesn't have to, it can be, whoops, it can be, you know, any shape, really. This is such a great way to use, when berries are in season, just the pastry and the fruit, just lightly sweet. It's such a great way to use your fruit. You're not doing a lot to it. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. Some more here. So if you want, as you can see, I'm just doing this deliberately just to show you. Do not worry if it's not a perfect round. So we want it to look homemade, don't we? We're not after perfection, we're after good tasting. So now, to move it over onto your baking sheet, what I do is I put my rolling pin there loosely. And if you had a lot of flour as you're rolling up, you know, you could have a pastry brush, which I forgot. I'll just use my hand and just roll off that, just brush off that extra flour, and then just pick it up and unroll it onto your baking sheet like so. And then I'm going to cover this with my plastic wrap, and we want to chill it again, let it firm up a little, and then relax the gluten in the flour. And while that's happening, you want to preheat your oven too. We're doing a fairly hot oven, 400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 200 degrees Celsius. And when I come back in a second, we will cut up our strawberries. So now for our strawberries. You will need about a pound of fresh strawberries, which is about 450 grams. Actually, I err on the side of extra, so maybe a pound and a quarter, maybe about 500 grams, because you never know if some are soft, or I don't mind a few extra strawberries on my tart. Now, when I don't actually like put my strawberries in a strainer and put the tap water over it, because I find they get too wet. So what I do is I have a wet paper towel, and then I just wipe them. Now you want to use really good tasting strawberries. If you have a U-pick nearby, this is perfect for it. And you don't want to cut your strawberries too big. I mean, if I have a strawberry like that size, I just cut it in half. If I just left like one like that or that, I don't cut them at all, because strawberries when they bake will break down, and we don't want jam. We want the chunks of strawberries. So like that, I'm just gonna leave it. If you have one like this, okay, you can tell this is from a U-pick farm. My son and daughter-in-law were nice enough to go and pick me some. So they're not like perfect. If you ever buy them in the grocery store, they're perfect. This one, kind of like that. So this one's a little larger. I am going to cut that in half. So I've already done that. And make sure you, of course, take the top, the green, off. So I have that. Now, taste your fruit. I mean, I'm only going to put U-pick are just wonderful compared to the store-bought. Taste your fruit, because I'm only going to put 1 tablespoon, about 15 grams of granulated white sugar on my strawberries, because they're so sweet. If yours, you know, you don't know. You look at the, actually you look at any fruit and it can look fantastic, but you know, you don't know when, if they picked it while they're still a little unripe, so they could be a little sour. So you might need to increase the sugar. I'm gonna leave that up to you, so taste it. They're really sweet. You only need, maybe even a little less, but I'm going to add 1 tablespoon, just put that in a bowl, 15 grams of granulated white sugar. And then the strawberries will break down and they're going to release their juices. So I am just going to add a half a teaspoon of cornstarch right in there. I mean, if your strawberries are really juicy, you could add a little more or a little less. I'm just going to mix that together. And I'm also going to add 1 teaspoon, just 1 teaspoon of freshly squeezed lemon juice. If you add a little bit, you only need a little bit of lemon juice to fruit, it just kind of brings out their flavor. Let's toss that. And the sugar. You can use this recipe of the pastry and the fruit like this for anything, blueberries, raspberries, peaches, it's just the amount of sugar that you're going to adjust. And it's simple to make, as you see, it's not really difficult. So, okay, once you get the hang of making pastry, I know that's the tricky part. So now I have my pastry, it's kind of not bad. And I am going to put about 1 tablespoon, 15 grams of sugar right on the bottom. And that'll collect, some juices. And you want to leave about a 2-inch border because we are going to wrap that pastry up and over our berries. That's 5 centimeters for those using the metric. That's about right. And then pile those. And if you have any juice or sugar left in the bowl, just kind of put that over the top. And okay, spread it out. It'll actually just make about, a layer, 1 layer. And I mean, you can kind of get, if you want to, which way do you want to have your cut side up, cut side down? I'll leave that up to you. That looks pretty good. Kind of pretty compacted in there. Okay, wipe my hands before I do the pastry. So now, let's see if my pastries. If your pastry is really still cold, I just kind of put my hand on it, because what we're going to do is fold it up, and I kind of pleat it like that. So if it was cracking, then just kind of hold your hand, and the warmth of your hand will heat up the pastry, like so. Now, I've done this a few times, but when I first started, I'd get cracking and stuff. So I just deliberately, and you can see I split the pastry. So just wrap it up and then kind of seal it like that, just with your fingers, because you don't want any slits, and you want to make sure, because otherwise the juices, when they start to run, will run right out on your baking sheet. That is why we have parchment paper, in case that happens. And then what you want to do is pat that pastry down, because if you don't really pat it down, it can open up. I've had that happen from in a rush, and I don't. So just make sure you pat that down, because we want it to look pretty. Okay, so again, just especially on the bottom, if you have any cracking, then just with your finger, seal those up. But you know what, don't worry if you get a little, I usually get a little juices on the baking sheet. Once you transfer it over to a serving platter, no one's going to know that happened. So now I like to brush the edges of my pastry with an egg wash. If you want to keep this eggless, you could just use cream or milk or even water. But what I'm using is 1 large egg yolk, 17 grams, and I'm just adding a teaspoon of cream. That really doing an egg wash or even cream really makes your crust golden brown. It just looks wonderful. So just whisk it together. I got a wire whisk and just use a fork. And then with a pastry brush, I'm just going to lightly brush the edges. Okay, and then just to add like a little bit of sweetness, I'm just taking a little bit of sugar. Adds a little bit of texture to our pastry. A little in the center, just make sure. So now, everyone's oven, everyone's oven is a little different. I'm going to say about 30 minutes, so it's pretty quick. So what you're looking for is the crust is going to be beautiful golden brown. And the important thing is the strawberries, there's going to be juices, and you want those juices to be bubbling around the edges and that. So even that out a bit. That's how you can tell, really with any fruit tart, is the juices start to bubble. That's your sign, along with the crust being a beautiful golden brown. Because ovens tend to have hot spots about halfway through, I rotate my baking sheet front to back. But I'm going to say, you know, somewhere around 30 minutes, could be a little less, could be a little more, depending on your oven. Okay. So our strawberry tart is done. So put your pan on a wire rack. As you can see, juices are bubbling. Doesn't that look wonderful? Beautiful golden brown crust. Now you can see there's lots of juices. So you do not want to cut into this until it cools right down. And that way the juices will thicken up. And then hopefully when we do cut it, the juices won't run, because we don't want that. So I'm going to let this sit at least an hour, maybe 2, and then when we come back, we will try a piece. So I let the strawberry tart cool down for about an hour, and if I kind of shake the pan, they look pretty thick. So let's give it a try and see what happens. So sharp knife. Now, if you wanted, I'm just cutting right on the pan. If you wanted to transfer the tart to your serving platter, if you have one of these large spatulas, works really good. But I just cut it right on the pan. Yeah, that's not running too much, so there we go. Doesn't that look wonderful? As you can see, because I cut them in fairly large chunks, they didn't break down too much. I mean, if yours did, it's no problem, but now, if I wasn't just taste testing, if I was serving this, or if I was on my own, I would have it with a scoop of ice cream, vanilla ice cream. That's what I like. But since we're just supposed to be tasting the tart and not the ice cream, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just have a little bit of the crust extra. I love pastry. So the pastry, because we cooked it long enough, it's golden brown. It is crisp, it is crumbly, buttery. I mean, I just love it. And so does Carrie. On my side here. And the strawberries, like I said, use strawberries, fresh strawberries when they're in season, when they taste really good. Because really all this is about is the buttery pastry and your strawberries. And we didn't add a lot of sugar, so you're just, to me, I love making these fruit tarts. I make them all year. You can make them all different fruit. Same basic principle, just you can vary the sugar and maybe add, a little cornstarch to the fruit to thicken the juices. but it's just so good. You can cover, if there is any leftovers, you can cover and store them in the refrigerator. You could even freeze this. I haven't just defrosted it in the fridge overnight, but you must try this. And until next time, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com.